One of the reasons why we, I think, can be a people who, in the midst of as Peter would say, a crooked and perverse generation, in a hassled and harried generation like America is in right now, one of the reasons why we can retain our peace and be at rest is because of the truth of that song and the reality of the scripture that says that whoever the next president is going to be, we already have our king. So it's a good song for 2019. It's a good song for 2020. And so with whatever the Lord has coming and whatever causes you angst in your world and in the society in which you live, you can bank everything on the fact that there is one person who holds all of history in his hand, and he just breaks each seal by his sovereign will. It all belongs to him. Jesus is Lord. And for those of you who know him, he is also the Christ. He is God's anointed, your Savior. So man, is he ever worthy. I have no idea how that applies to this message with children obeying your parents. Actually, I really do know how it applies, because isn't everything in this book about Christ? Doesn't Ephesians 1:9 and 10 tell us that the goal of our Christian life is that Christ might be seen to be the sum of every single part of our life? And doesn't that spill into, then, our homes? Dads, don't you then need to have that frame your fatherhood? And moms, doesn't that need to inform your work of motherhood? And child, doesn't that mean that you need to strive to obey, not for the sake of rote compliance, but for the sake of the grand cause for which every Christian on the planet exists, which is so that Christ can be seen to be worthy in your life? So this is the message that every parent has been waiting for. This is the sermon that every child has not been waiting for. I'm surprised there's students in the room knowing what's coming. I think we've mentioned this before, but we plan to embark here on a 13-sermon series on every single aspect of Ephesians 6:1. We're not going to exposit every verse. We're not going to exposit every phrase. We're not going to exposit every word. We're not going to exposit every letter. We're going to exposit the dot on every I and the T that gets crossed in Ephesians 6:1. By Christmas, we should be done talking about obedience. Oh, it's fun. Hey, look, I mean, if you don't laugh in parenting, you're going to cry sometimes. And so here I pulled out some really funny quotes I found made me laugh. And these are just to kind of get you transitioned a little bit into this context. But some mom online wrote, 90% of parenting is just thinking about when you can lie down again. I like that. That's good. That's obviously written by a mom. Or how about this one? Being a mom means kids banging on the bathroom door like the SWAT team, yelling for a drink while dad's down in the kitchen. Oh, not in my home. I never do that. And this is one obviously coming from a dad. Raising kids is part joy, part guerrilla warfare. Part guerrilla warfare. Oh, my word. You know, it's interesting. That's meant to be funny, but that's actually pretty true, isn't it? I mean, parents, isn't it true that parenting is a joy? And many times it's a war. And, you know, we're living in Ephesians 6 in the shadow of the end of the book with spiritual warfare, aren't we? It's like that topic is like just on the horizon. And almost like its shadow is casting itself back on this particular idea that in the home, there is a lot of joy in the midst of a war. And of course, the enemy would love nothing more than for you, moms and dads, to make the war about you with your kids. The enemy would love nothing more, kids, than for you to declare war on your folks. He wants to aim the war at each other, when the reality is that the war is against the enemy, against our flesh, against the world system that wants to reframe and contort and twist and pervert what God is lining out here for the home. There's a war on, even in the happiest of homes. It is true, raising kids is part joy, part war. And for those of you who have families where it just seems like there is no joy, it's all war. Well, I've been praying for you, that God would give you an understanding again of joy in the home that might break through the never-ending conflict. And if your home is only joy, well, just keep living life for a while. The effects of the fall, at some point, will probably step into your home. And so the time to prepare yourself for war is in a time of peace. The reality is that the passages before us arranged very simply. I don't think it's difficult. But there are implications here that I think are helpful for us by way of moving toward application for us today that I would like to give attention to. And so we're only going to get through verse 1. So let me read the passage, all of verses 1 through 4, and then know that we're only going to get to verse 1. And we'll pick up to verse 2 and 3, and then, Lord willing, 4 next week. Children, Ephesians 6, verse 1, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. This first verse is so well known and so worn in our homes that we can miss actually several implications that are sitting right on the top of the passage. Right up front in the passage, we can miss implications contained even in the very first word, children. Now, the reality is structurally in the household code, Ephesians 5:21, but really beginning of 5:22, the household code has been starting out this way in every section. Wives, Ephesians 5:22. Husbands, Ephesians 5:25. Now children, Ephesians 6, verse 1. This is consistent, and yet it's surprising. It's surprising because the Apostle Paul is here addressing children directly, and that wasn't done in the Greco-Roman period. The household codes of the Greco-Roman period did not very often at all address children directly. They would address children through the parents as kind of a bit of an afterthought, a secondary glance into the home. But what Paul's doing here by using this address, children, he's addressing children directly in the context of the church. It assumes, by way of implication, by the way, that there will be those who are listening when this letter is read to the church who will be children in the church. The implications that Paul would have addressed the children in the Ephesian church directly, which makes me wonder about Paul. Because I don't know. I think about Paul as like this just super flamethrower. He's just dropping bombs in different cities, planting churches. He can't be bothered with little people. That's kind of how I just imagine him like constantly on the move, looking to preach his next great sermon, looking to plant the next amazing church, looking to step into the next big pile of controversy with his apostolic authority, and he's just taking care of business for the gospel. Can't be bothered with people like kids. Actually, Greco-Roman ethicists and moralists and rhetoricians and orators who are writing about families would do that, actually. They would skip over the kids. But here's Paul addressing children directly. It makes me wonder, actually, do you think that Paul spent time with kids in the church? I don't know. I mean, it's a weird thought. I sat and thought about this first word and thought, maybe Paul actually knew some of these kids. Not sure what difference that makes. It's just an implication, though, isn't it, that he's taking the time to address children specifically. Another implication of this is, and following on the last, was that Paul was addressing children of all ages. From cradle to grave, he knew how to keep things simple and straightforward with regard to children. Cradle to grave. Yeah. I mean, chapter 6, verse 1 is a command for children who are still under the authority of the parents in the home of the parents. But verse 2 continues through all of life. Are you a child this morning? Then guess what? You're in this passage. Yeah, but I'm a child, but my parents are like, 94 and I'm 68. I mean, I think we're kind of done with the whole honoring thing, right? Nope, that command still applies. As long as you have parents around or a parent around, that is still applicable. And so, surprise, Ephesians 6, 1 through 4, it's for a lot more kiddos than you think. It ain't just for 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. It's potentially for 55-year-olds and 42-year-olds and so on. And I want to share with you another implication of this. With Paul addressing children. Paul, the single man, addressing children. And this is an encouragement for our singles. Because guess what? You don't have to be a parent to help with parenting. I am so worn out with people saying, well, you can't speak in that situation. You haven't gone through it. Have you not read your Bible? I mean, did Paul have kids? Answer, no, as far as we know. Did he speak to kids? Yes. Does he help with parenting? Absolutely. Do all of us seek counsel as parents from a single man? Yes. So, if you're single here this morning, you can have a role to play. And in fact, one of the people in this church who's had the most profound impact on the most children in our church is Rod McCleary. He's parented more of your kids than some of you have parented your kids. I'll stack him against any dad. Because he's like a spiritual dad to hundreds of kids. So, if you're single here, you have a lot to give to us who are married and our parents. A lot. Please don't stop listening. Please help us who are parents. I mean, good grief, would any parent say they don't need help? Raise your hand if you think you don't need help as a parent. Okay, there's like one. Go get her some help, okay? So, because she's thinking she doesn't need it. I'm just kidding. I know, Gabby, you're okay, but I'm just goofing around. But isn't that interesting, though? Just by way of thinking about children, another implication, which moves us toward application, is that the pastor, by maybe some parallel, a lesser parallel, should address children directly, at least on occasion, in his messages. I think it's fair to say that there are children who still remember when Pastor John would address them directly, maybe at a holiday service. Or when children are brought up on stage and addressed directly at like a Christmas service. Still remember that. Children don't forget that stuff. When they actually are not ignored in a worship service, they're addressed. And so the sermon should keep in mind, at least on occasion, look, I mean, it's not that Paul's mentioning kids every single passage, right? So this is on occasion, but at least on occasion, it's not wrong, and in fact, it's appropriate to address children from time to time in the sermon. And so that will happen at least today. The fact of the matter is, there's a lot of implication with the Apostle Paul taking time out of a very profoundly deep letter to address your kiddos. And we can just be thankful for this passage. It's so simple. It's so simple and short, not because it's not important, but because Paul knows who he's speaking to. He's speaking to children. You don't have a treatise when shepherding kids. You get to the point quick, right? I'm looking at Kelly Alexander. She knows. Keep your lessons on point because kids are going to have shorter attention spans. Doesn't make this passage less important. It actually acknowledges who you're talking to. Now, with all those implications in mind, just bound up in the single word, children, we want to move on to the command, which is obey. And the reality is that is a command. What does it mean? Some of us might want to inform that a certain way. Like, oh yeah, you want to ask me what I think about when I think about obey as a parent? I think about you do whatever I tell you to do. And for some parents, that's what they think obedience means. Unthinking compliance. Sir, yes, sir. Several observations should be made about this term, obey. First, it's command, so that's a no-brainer. Second of all, not many commentators actually took time to define obedience. I was actually a little bit surprised by that. What does obedience mean? I went looking for definitions. I didn't find many. I guess it's maybe assumed. One commentator who took the time to explain and define what obedience meant stated that obedience consists in, quote, listening to the advice given by parents. Listening to advice given by parents. Now, I'm not sure if I like that definition. Because when you as a parent say something that needs to be listened to, you're not giving advice that you like warmly commend to your children and invite them to listen to. And that's what obedience means. How many of you think that's what obedience means? If you think it means that, you're off, okay? That's not what the New Testament communicates about this term. So I don't know where he got that from. That's a weak definition. Actually, in every occurrence of obedience in the New Testament, it expresses what you'd expect. Immediate responsiveness and compliance to authority. Now, it's more nuanced than that. It's not just sir, yes, sir, unthinkingly. But it is immediate responsiveness and compliance to authority. And by the way, I think that's perfectly consistent with what you see in the overall context in this letter reaching back to Ephesians 5:21, where the call to the church is that we are to be submitting to one another in the fear of Christ. And so what does that fear look like? What does that submission look like? Well, it looks like wives submitting to their husbands in the context of the church. It looks like husbands leading and loving their wives in the context of the church. And it looks like now children obeying their parents in the Lord, for this is right in the context of the church. This submission to different authorities in the household code set forth here is consistent with what that word means in Ephesians 6:1. So the definition is immediate responsiveness and compliance to authority. That seems to represent the broadest sweep of all the occurrences in the New Testament. But there are overtones or nuances within that definition. So as you read the occurrences of obedience in the New Testament, you pick up on things like, and nuances like, to listen to, or to bend your ear toward. So like you're kind of, everybody's talking, but you're bending your ear to listen to your mom and dad, or mom or dad, depending on the home you're coming from. So you're kind of bending your ear that way. You're also willing to answer. You don't choose not to answer. That's not obedience. It also can mean in other places to surrender your will to something. To surrender your will, which is to say that you acknowledge that you have a will. This is why it's not unthinking. You have a will, you have preferences as a child, but you surrender those in obedience to your parents. It can have nuances of that. And then it can simply mean something like just to respond to. Don't shut your parents out. Like just the silent treatment's not obedience. Doing nothing is doing something. And so that's some of the overtones, or the nuances that inform and frame in the word and give it a little bit more richness on the top of the definition. So that's the definition. There are some overtones in the semantic range of obedience. And then another observation on obedience is that there's one example that's helpful. Definition, overtones or nuances, number two. And then now another observation. There is a good example, or a kind of a word picture of what obedience looks like. It's found in Acts 12, verse 13. Acts 12, verse 13, where Peter knocks on the door of the house with Rhoda, the servant girl. He'd just been miraculously set free, and so he comes back to the house where the people inside have been praying for him. And the scripture says in that verse that Rhoda answers and opens the door. That is the word, open the door, is the word for obedience. Same word. And so there's a good word picture. What does obedience look like? It looks like, hey mom, hey dad, I heard you knocking about something in my life. I heard you knocking on the door of this issue in my life. and I'm opening the door to let you into that issue. I'm not keeping the door closed. I'm not yelling through the door, you can't come in here. I'm not hiding in the corner and hoping that you don't hear me. As soon as you come knocking on any issue in life, I'm opening the door and letting you in. What would you like to know? How would you like me to grow? What would you like for me to do? It's a good word picture. When the parent comes knocking, you open the door in any area of life. By the way, side note, this is not about obedience, but that's not a bad way to live life in your marriage. Anywhere your spouse wants to knock on the door in any area of your life, I mean, I suppose maybe there's some exceptions if you're, working for the government and you have classified information. But for the most part, you're opening the door and letting them in. I was talking to a family after NCT yesterday. How many of you went to NCT, by the way? Yeah, okay, good. So what a blessing. But yeah, talking to a couple yesterday from different church, and they came up to me and they said, hey, so we're just trying to figure out with parenting how to handle our child's phone. We're kind of finding that we can't control it. And I'm like, well, you do control it. So step number 1 is he who pays for it controls it. That's your phone, not their phone. And that was like a revelation to them. Like, oh, you're right. We're paying for that phone. That phone belongs to us. Now, it's problematic if the kid is paying for the phone. You're in a pickle. And what I told that person is, don't let him pay for the phone. So we had a good laugh about that. But my point is still the same. No, that student should be willing to let you fan through their phone anywhere. I told the couple right here, and by the way, hubs, you should be willing to let your wife do this in your phone too. And wife, you should be willing to let your husband do this in your phone. Everybody's phone is wide open. Now, of course, you have to be thoughtful about information. I get that. But you understand the spirit of it, though, right? So, yeah, I mean, it is, the parents come knocking, you open up the door and let them into your life in any area they are wanting to ask about. Obedience. In fact, the Pentateuch, I'm just reviewing with you again. So here's the definition. There are some nuances or some overtones. There's a word picture, an example, and now a warning. A warning. The Pentateuch, or Deuteronomy, warns of the danger of having a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him. That's the picture of disobedience. Deuteronomy 21:18. A stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother. So what does disobedience look like? It looks like stubborn rebellion. Now on this, we're helped parents. Because how many times have you had it happen where two children come up and they're in conflict? And you hear them telling you the story, and you're starting to land on, okay, well, this child disobeyed, so I'm just going to move in on this child. And then right at the last minute before you pronounce that disobedience, your spouse walks in and says, hey, before you say anything, they give you the look like this. Like, are you following me? Don't do anything yet. There's more information. And then your spouse tells you, actually, what you thought was disobedience right there, there's more information, and it wasn't at all disobedience. They just didn't understand. Or maybe that only happens in our home and not in your home. And so all of a sudden now you were about ready to go in discipline because you thought that was disobedience. No. Disobedience is not misinformation or misunderstanding. Disobedience is stubborn rebellion. That's disobedience. And so if you're a parent and you're just learning about this whole parenting thing, there's a good grid for you. Was there willful rebellion? Okay, that's disobedience. And of course, it still calls for wisdom, because kids hear me say that. Even now, kids are hearing that and going, I can work around that. I only say that, children, because I vaguely remember thinking that when I was a child too. You're very, very smart. So there's the warning. You need to be careful, parents, that the call for children to obey is not something you use as a hammer. But you need to be consistent. Now, speaking of children obeying, how do they obey? Well, that's right there in the next phrase. They obey in the Lord. I think that this means it's in the Christian home and the context of the Christian home, in the Lord, in the context of the church. The Colossians parallel is helpful actually here. In Colossians 3, I think you can use the parallel passage to interpret what this means. It means that obedience in this way pleases the Lord. So in the Lord pleases the Lord. Even children in their own simple way can know what it means to obey in the Lord, to obey for Jesus' sake. They can understand that even at an early age. A couple commentators make this out to be that it only is referring here to Christian children, children who are actually in the Lord. I think that's an impossible premise, because wouldn't there have been unsaved children in the church at Ephesus when this letter was being read? But then why didn't Paul say it more clearly? So I think he's addressing children and teaching them, and this is the challenge, that there's a greater motivation rooted in obedience than just obeying your parents. And I think this is helpful because it gives kids some motivation to obey even if their mom and dad are hard for them. If mom and dad are hard for them, it can be really difficult for children to obey. But look, there's a higher motivation than obeying just your parents. You're obeying your parents in the Lord. You have this motivation that's rooted in Christ himself. This is very helpful in the context of blended families, or in contexts where there's a single parent who's having another parenting situation happening in parallel in a different place with an ex-spouse. This little in the Lord gives wisdom. All obedience rendered in life is rendered ultimately to the Lord, such that as they eventually, Lord willing, come to Christ savingly by faith, your training, moms and dads, in this kind of obedience will be matched with faith. And then it blossoms as their own faith. And they obey Christ out of their own heart of faith, and then also with obedience. And interestingly, too, I just want to comment on the in the Lord thing. There's some encouragement here for children, too, along a different line. Because the phrase in the Lord appears down in chapter 6, verse 10. Check it out. Look down in chapter 6, verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. So there's a call there to be strengthened in the Lord. There is strength that comes in the Lord to stand firm in spiritual warfare. It refers in chapter 6, verse 10 to God's enabling strength. So if that sense of in the Lord in verse 10 is present back up in verse 1, which I think is reasonable in the context, then children, listen, are not just being commanded to obey here in verse 1, they're being assured of God's help as they do obey, which I think is super cool. Because again, there are many times where a child will say, I know I'm supposed to do this because I'm called to do it. I do not feel like doing this. Well, as you obey, God will give you the strength to do what you do not want to do on your own strength. The Lord will help children to obey who depend upon him. So parents, make sure that you don't just tell your children to obey. Make sure that you tell them and encourage them that after they obey or as they obey, the Lord's helping them. And by the way, you're setting good tracks in parenting for that child's life, where they learn from you that every act of obedience is strengthened by the Lord. And by the way, parents, just on this point in the Lord, that's a really sweet way for children to be rolling in your home. They're being called to obey, but they're being strengthened to obey. That just sounds a lot like the Christian life in general, and they're learning it under your shepherding. In fact, parents, this is the God-given recipe for peace and joy in your home. I mean, think about it for a second. The wife submitting to her husband is submitting to her husband as unto Christ. The husband is loving his wife just as Christ loved the church. Now here, children are obeying their parents in the Lord. This is the kind of home that's pictured in Ephesians 5 and 6. But this is also the kind of home that you find in Psalm 128. Turn back there for a second for a parallel to the happiness and the holiness of a home lived for Christ. In Psalm 128, you see a man in the context of his home who is really happy. He's a happy man. Why? Well, look at his home. Psalm 128. Blessed or happy is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. There's this man who is fearing the Lord, walking in his ways. He's happy. Well, who is this guy? Well, you shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You will be blessed, and it will be well with you. Man, this guy sounds great. Who is he? He's a husband. He's a dad. Look at verse 3. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Do you have a vine around your house? Some vines around your house become vines like in your house because they're so vigorous. You plant that little bad boy and you look out one day like in, April, and you're like, hey, it's got a little shoot. That's pretty cute. And then you come back in another couple weeks and now it's a little like micro bush. And then you come back in like midsummer and you're going, man, I should probably maybe prune that thing. It's looking a little gangly. Hey, wait, is it going up on my house? And then you don't do anything. You go on vacation, you come back, and it's like up onto your second story roof. There's some vines that grow that fast. They just take off. Yeah, that's like your wife. For the man who fears the Lord, the man who does his job as a husband, his wife just flourishes. And his children will be like olive shoots. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. Olive shoots, you guys probably know this, are in Jewish context and culture said to be trees that never die. They never die because even if the main tree grows up, it takes centuries. It can grow for centuries, and they even grow for millennia. There's even some olive trees that some people suspect in the Garden of Gethsemane were there when Christ was in the Garden of Gethsemane 2,000 years ago. They're that old. But what's fun about those trees is they're sending up shoots. So when that tree finally does die, the shoots grow out of the same stump, and that tree keeps living. That's the picture here. You've got shoots, this godly man who fears the Lord, this man who's doing his job, leading and loving his wife, parenting his kids. This man's got shoots that will outlive him and make this man very happy, blessed. The Lord bless you then from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. That's a sweet picture of a sweet home. Now, is that law? Is that promising you that in every case, if you just fear the Lord, that's the magic sauce that guarantees that your home is going to look just like this? Nope. Because this is wisdom. This is a wisdom psalm, which means that generally speaking in life, this happens. But it also acknowledges that in the generality of the truth, there are going to be exceptions. And in fact, you find exceptions even in the life of the psalmists who wrote many of these psalms. So don't take it overboard, but know that this is a happy home. When each one is focused on the fulfilling of their roles, back in Ephesians 5, for the same reason, that Christ might be the sum of all things. Wives submitting as under Christ. Husbands loving just like Christ. The children obeying their parents in the Lord, in Christ. Oh, wait a minute, that sounds like the purpose of the book. Yep. Everybody doing their part to make much of the Lord. Depending on the Lord. Different roles, but identical motivations in the Lord. Now, that's how. That follows the what. But what about the why? Why? Why should I obey? Some kid says here at NorthCreek Church this morning. That's great. The what, the how, whatever. I need to know why. Well, here comes the apostolic equivalent of, because I told you so. You ready? Here it is. for this is right. Period. You don't need any more justification than that. Now, the reality is that when we say, because I told you so, we are totally out of gas. We have no more momentum to argue our point. We don't have any justification left. We've already spent our ammo, and our kids have good reason to appeal the way they're appealing, and so we're down to our last straw. And the last straw we pull is, because I said so. And that's supposed to help, right? Well, actually, in this case, it really does. This simple call to obedience has been assumed in our society for hundreds of years, but the wheels are coming off in our generation on this. Right before your eyes, the wheels are coming off, man. The world's mantra in parenting today is the exact opposite of Ephesians 6:1. In fact, let me give you the mantra for the world today with regard to parenting. Put your eyeballs on Ephesians 6:1, and I will translate for you with the world translation. Okay? You ready? Which isn't a translation. I'm just going to fake it. Parents, obey your children, for this is right. I mean, that's right there. It's gospel truth. Parents, obey your children, for this is right. And will bring happiness and maintain peace in the home, which is all that anybody can hope for, right? I mean, you realize that we live in a world where children obeying their parents is not right. Look at the text again. The world radically disagrees with what you read right over. For this is right? I disagree. That's wrong. In fact, this whole household code in Ephesians has been turned on its head in our world today. Consider this. I have a cool little chart in my notes. It's not going to get on the screens. Husbands, wives, children. The Bible calls husbands to love your wife. The world calls husbands to leave their wife. Leave her behind. If you don't like her, leave her. If she's inconvenient for you, leave her. If you have a better option, leave her. If you're too busy to be bothered with commitments at home, leave them behind. The Bible says love your wife. The world says leave her. An inversion. The Bible tells wives to submit to their husbands. The world tells wives to lead their husbands. The Bible tells children to obey your parents. The world tells children to have parents obey you. Hey, newsflash, everybody. The world has completely turned this household code on its head. Or, the world is telling you, this stuff is a lie. We have a better path. Now, in case you wonder about that, wouldn't you want to maybe agree? In fact, go check it out for yourself. Any TV show in the last generation, any movie in the last generation. Try to find a father who isn't a complete dum-dum. I mean, just a stumbling, bumbling idiot. Completely unable and disinterested in leading. Go try to find a dad like that in any TV show or movie. Go try to find a wife who's happy to submit. Good luck as you go look for that girl. Try to find a child who doesn't run the joint. Who's in charge in the world's homes? The kid. The kid's in charge. Come on, man. Are you kidding? This is the 21st century. Who's in charge next? The mom, the wife. Who's in charge last? The dad, of course. Why do we even have this conversation? Children, your parents obey you, and the Lord obey you. That's right. So see, what we take for granted is actually not to be taken for granted anymore. Disobedience is running at an all-time high these days. Not just in our homes, but especially in our schools. And this is a little tangent. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But in talking to some of our teachers in this church, and I had 4 teachers find me after the service and say, it's worse than you even described it to be. And they weren't all public school teachers either. But here's what happens in schools as I talk to teachers. They testify to the fact that students are more disrespectful than ever, due in large part because parents are always siding with their children. Their children are always right. And the teacher, therefore, has to justify anything they do to correct their child. They will not discipline their children in the home, and they demand that teachers do not discipline their child in the classroom. We have moved beyond discipline, by the way. We've given away discipline in the last generation. Nobody can discipline a student anymore. We can't even correct students now. We reject all forms of discipline in the home, and therefore, any form of discipline is rejected in the kid's school. In these kinds of homes, kids are the parents' authority. Children are always right in their parents' eyes. Well, that sounds like you're mentioning the book of Judges. I am mentioning the book of Judges very much on purpose. Children are doing what is right, and it's always right in their parents' eyes. We had a very helpful older couple in our life at some point when we were newly married, before we started having kids, who said to us, because they were involved in education, when you have kids someday, you need to have your default mode be with your teacher, your kids' teachers, that you listen to them first. I mean, who's wiser in the classroom, the teacher or the student? Who knows more, the teacher or the student? Who's more of a pro, the teacher or the student? My student is. That's the cry of the day. Now, I actually prefer the wisdom of that older couple who said, no, actually listen to your teacher first. Now, admittedly, there's going to be a bad apple. There are some bad teachers out there. Admittedly, I got it. This is not universal law. It's just some godly wisdom that was passed along to us, but we should be supporting the teachers that God has placed in authority over our kids. In fact, this might be part and parcel of verse 2. The Westminster Children's Catechism, written in the 1640s in the midst of the English Civil War, was written so that parents might have a way to instruct their children across a whole spectrum of theological and practical concerns in the home and in life. One of the questions in that catechism goes like this: what is the fifth commandment? And the child is to answer, the fifth commandment is to honor your father and mother. The next question: what does the fifth commandment teach you? The child's answer is this: to love and obey my parents and all those God has placed in authority over me. Wow, that's quite an implication from the command. How did they get there? I mean, that's a great answer. They got there by the implication of the fifth commandment. You honor your father and mother and all of those who God has placed in authority over you. That's the child's call. That's bound up in obedience. As you look at the scriptures across the whole tenor of them, that's a great answer, by the way. And nobody believes it in our generation. I mean, you'd get laughed out of the schoolroom with an answer like that. Now, they understood that it was good and right, generally speaking. Not in every case, but generally speaking, your default mode should be to love and obey your parents and to love and obey others in authority. We are totally missing that in this culture. And so this pattern of increased disobedience to parents and authorities is a symptom, one writer says, of a disintegrating social structure. The structures of society are disintegrating because children will not listen to anybody. Give that 20 years to marinate and come back and check on our culture. Let that brew in the children's children and see how much more toxic it gets. Actually, what's cool about that is I don't get freaked out by that at all. I get super pumped about that. You want to know why? Because as a Christian family, by your very composition, you are able to shine even brighter as lights in your community. Just by being a Christian family, man. Just by daring to have you as a wife support your husband. Holy moly, that's like turning the world upside down. Actually, it is turning the world upside down. A husband that loves his wife and leads his wife? Nobody does that. Yeah, you're inverting the world's roles. You're turning the world upside down. Children that would actually respect their parents and like being with them and obey them? Nobody does that, except for Christian children. Your very presence in the community is going to become disruptive more and more, and I love it. And you should lean into that disruption. Everybody's talking about being a technological disruptor, right? An innovative disruptor. Well, guess what? This is pretty innovative. It's pretty disruptive. And actually, it's not innovative at all. It's super old. It's back to the garden stuff. But I think it's super great. What an opportunity that we have to stand out for the Lord. Teenagers, as difficult as your continued obedience is as a teenager, remember that this is right and it pleases the Lord. And so keep up the good work. Toward what end? Toward what end? Well, I just want to take the rest of our time and camp on some application. Toward the end of being a child who does what's right and thus pleases the Lord. So if you're a child here this morning, I just want to address you and give you some practical help on obedience in this way. Parents, you can listen into this and you can take notes. These are mostly for older children, but you can take notes and apply them to younger children yourself. Older children who are here, number one, application question. What are the reasons for your obedience to mom and dad? What are the reasons for your obedience to mom and dad? Why do you obey them? I mean, you could obey them out of fear of punishment, right? A fear of discipline. That's kind of like the police. You'd see your parents then as the police. They're there to help us obey the law. That's a good thing. We need that in society. But in the context of the home, we need more than just that. You're not trying to just avoid punishment. You shouldn't be obeying simply because you don't want to be disciplined. That's a very base level motive. You should be moving past that. Obedience motivated by fear will not carry you very far. It's valid, but it's not ultimate. Do you obey for a reward? I mean, I know we as parents sometimes motivate children with to obedience with some kind of reward. Hey, if you obey, I'll buy you a triple cheeseburger with 3 slices of cheese. Going into no man's land now with 3 slices. We'll do it if you obey. But that's not the best reason to obey your parents. Why? Because it just builds on selfishness. I just obey to get something out of it. That's not the ultimate reason for obedience. I suppose there are some cases where it's helpful to be rewarded for obedience. I get it. It can turn quickly into a bribe. That's also true, and you should be careful. But for the most part, you, child, would want to be obeying for more reasons than just fear of discipline and a promise of a reward. The reality is that you should obey out of love for your parents. Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Yeah, exactly. That's the highest expression of true obedience. It's the best kind of obedience, done out of a heart that loves the Lord and loves your mom and dad. And so when it gets hard to obey, you pray and you ask God in the moment, God, help me to obey in the Lord. Help me to obey because I love my mom and dad. And that heart work then drives long-term, sustained, difficult acts of obedience. It's the highest form of motive for obedience, not just for children, but for the Christian life. Number 2, obedience can be hard work, so stick with it. I mean, medical experts say that if you want to achieve the desired results of physical fitness and strength, then you should not just dip your big toe into the pool of working out. You shouldn't just try working out. Just think about it, try a little bit, and if I put on 20 pounds of muscle in 2 weeks, then I'll keep going. Otherwise, I'm out. No, to get there, you have to not merely try exercise, you have to commit to exercise. And in fact, if you really commit to exercise up front, you're going to notice that you feel tired and weak. You're going to be sore. It's going to hurt up front. And then come the results, the benefits on the back end. Over the long haul, regular exercise does produce better physical fitness and strength, but only through those beginning struggles. And I would tell you, teenagers, if you're struggling, this same principle applies to your obedience. It might hurt to obey in a new way, but just keep at it, stick with it, and you'll get stronger for it. God's teaching you endurance. He's teaching you perseverance. Keep up the good work by God's grace, and you'll be the stronger for it. You'll be a better man. You'll be a better woman. And then third of all, ask your parents where you can work on obedience. Now, I know that this is a little weird. I don't think that kids typically ask their parents the following questions. Maybe your kids are like, oh, no, we have these conversations all the time. Well, we can see. But these are some questions that, if you're a child here this morning, under the care of your parents, in their home, and with your fingers in their bank account, then these questions are some questions that you can ask them to grow in your obedience. Question number 1, do you think that I talk back too much? Question number 2, how can I get better at expressing my thankfulness for you as my parents? Question number 3, how can I build your trust in me? How can I build your trust in me? Number 4, do you know the problems and the struggles I'm experiencing right now? Can you open up to your parents and let them see what you're struggling with? Number 5, I know I complain sometimes, but do you think I complain too much? And if so, what do I complain about most? I mean, that's not just an excuse. Like, I know I complain, I'm working on it. No, you're really actually acknowledging you're failing and you're trying to grow. What do I complain about the most? Ask your folks. Do you sense that I'm angry with you in any way? Do you feel like you know my friends at least a little bit, or am I trying to keep my friends from you? Is that what you sense I'm doing? Number 8, do you think I'm doing my part with household chores? Oh, what a blessing that question would be. Just go ask your parents and let them just sit back and smile. The day has finally arrived where my child's asking me what chores they can do. I'm just kidding, right? I'm kidding. I'm mostly kidding. All right, next question. Do you think I obey you in the Lord or in my own strength? And number 10, overall, how can I grow my obedience to you and the Lord? Children, you have a job to do too in the home. And it's not easy. And we're not done with you, because 2 through 4 still awaits. But did you know that some of the most powerful manifestations of gospel truth can be seen by unbelievers when they see obedient children? It is shocking to see a child who delights to obey. It can be one of the most surprising demonstrations that the gospel is real. And children, that's your privilege to display. So obey your parents in the Lord. We'll come back next week and we're going to talk about honoring mom and dad. And by the way, that's where all of us become kids. We have a lot to talk about with regard to, if you still have a living parent, what does it mean to honor them? So come back next week and we'll talk about that with installment number 2 of 12 more sermons to go. Father, thank you for this time this morning. It's a blessing to be able to open up your word. I just am so thankful for those teachers that bum rushed me in the back. Lord, with more urgency now, I pray that you would help those of us who are involved in the education system at any level, and not just in the public school, but in the private schools, in the Christian schools, in the charter schools, even in home schools. Lord, help us to be, just lights there. This is on all of us, God. Each of us have our part to play, including our children, and actually profoundly our children. And so, God, I pray that we would rise up and with the strength you give to us, fulfill our role and our responsibility and our privilege before you. Father, I pray specifically for children here, that there would be conversations that would overcome conflict. Long-standing conflict, no doubt, in some homes. I know it. I know it's true. God, please help there to be conversations that would overcome long-standing conflict. Cause there to be, God, a humbling of hearts and a humbling of minds from children to parents and parents to children that would want to sit down together and understand and experience the peace and the blessing that comes from having a wife who's flourishing and having children that are growing and all of that for the sake of blessing and blessing your great name in return. We need your help in this, Lord. Our children need your help in this. God, thank you for the reminder that singles are so strategic in this grand enterprise of this household code. They are not to be disengaged. God, help them to find their place too. Even around our tables, help them to find our place. Or their place, rather. Lord, I just thank you for how the church can rally to run to Christ together and make him the sum of everything we're about here at NorthCreek. God, make that be the case more and more. So we love you, and we do ask that you'd help our children to obey us, not just for our sake, but more than for our sake, ultimately, O God, for Christ's sake, in whom we always pray. Amen.